listening to Overwatch League Daily, your daily source for Overwatch League news, scores, and more. Here's your host, KickedTripod.
Good morning, Overwatch League fans. This is your Overwatch League daily episode for February 18th, 2018. Today I'm joined by Overwatch League analyst Bren Hook to discuss the teams that he thinks you should look out for between Stage 1 going into Stage 2. We did have one brief piece of news today, and that was, well, actually yesterday, Fact Fiction, former FaZe Clan member with Raucus and Spree, will be joining the Houston Outlaws. So that is one of the new pieces of news that we have for you today. But let's go ahead, jump in with Bren, and get to today's topic. So to continue on with our Stage 2 Primer series, I'm joined by Overwatch League analyst Bren to discuss some of the teams going into Stage 2. Stage 1 was very much designed to set the stage, which is an awful word choice, yes, I know, but to set the stage for what we should expect throughout the first season. But between meta changes, map pool changes, and player signings, there's a new opportunity for teams to capitalize or honestly decline in Stage 2. So Bren, which teams do you think have the most room to improve going into Stage 2?
I personally believe that there's not a single team going into the league that should not be improving with the meta changes that we're going into it with. The Mercy meta wasn't great for a variety of teams. New York Excelsior actually played incredibly well in the Mercy meta. I think it helped them out a ton, but across the board, every team should be improving much more now, considering we've been in a sort of Lucio-themed meta before the Mercy meta, much longer than that, whereas Lucio was always the staple. So you're going to start to see a lot of these supports that were underperforming in Stage 1, probably going to start to perform on a level that is a bit better. But in terms of which teams have the most room to improve, I'd probably go with Seoul Dynasty, because they underperformed quite significantly compared to where we'd placed them. I mean, a lot of people were placing them as the first seed coming into Stage 2, but coming into Stage 1, I should say. Not even that, coming into Stage 2, but they did underperform quite massively in terms of their placement. And now that Ryu Jae-hong doesn't have to play Mercy, I'm expecting him to be performing back at the previous level that he is known for. Yeah, I feel like coming into this, Seoul Dynasty, definitely one of the teams I'm keeping an eye on. But across the board, every team should be improving.
Do you think that there's any teams that maybe might struggle with some of the changes going on, maybe between the meta and the map pool?
Yes, actually. Any team that doesn't have these Korean, mainly like a vast majority of Korean players in, with the exception of maybe Valiant and Outlaws, are going to be in trouble. The reason I say this is because a lot of these Western teams in the Mercy meta won a lot of these close matchups because the Mercy meta sort of created a sort of chaotic environment in terms of the way the games were played out. Valkyrie as an ability was grossly overpowered, so a lot of fights were just won excuse me, by the team that could farm up Valkyrie the fastest. And if you had Valkyrie coming into the team fight, you were going to win it a vast majority of times compared to the enemy. That was actually how a lot of these Western teams, whereas before you wouldn't put them really on the same pedestal as some of these mainly Korean roster teams coming into this, like London, Seoul, New York. That's how they sort of took maps and took wins away from them. And, you know, Seoul definitely looked worse in the Mercy meta, but the Western teams, because they've adapted to it, and it allowed these sort of team fights to be won just solely off the base of this single ultimate, because essentially you're going into it with a massive player advantage. That's the way it worked. Means that with the changes now gone, coming into Stage 2, these teams, if they don't fix the coordination issues that we've already seen from them, are going to be looking a lot worse. And by that, I mean teams that we're looking at, like LA Gladiators as an example in terms of their tank play. Now, they did recently bring in Fisher. I'm going to touch on that a little bit later, which is going to help them out massively. But a lot of these teams were pretty much only winning fights because of Valkyrie as an ability. So with that gone now, I feel like a lot of these Western teams, if they don't work on their coordination, which is something that the Koreans excel at, they might be in a bit of trouble.
So you brought up Fissure, but I want to go a little bit more broad. How big of a factor do you think that roster signings will have on Stage 2, at least from what we know so far?
Pretty big, to be honest. A lot of these teams, so I know for a fact Shanghai Dragons, all the signings they're going to have are going to be helping them tremendously. However, not going to have access to those players until midway through Stage 2, which isn't the greatest. It's not the greatest for them. However, I know a lot of these teams behind the scenes, sort of unconfirmed reports, both confirmed and unconfirmed, are going to be a lot better off now that they've had a few signings, because we've had an entire stage to work out what the weaknesses were on a lot of these rosters in terms of whether or not, in the case of Dallas Fuel, they didn't really have a solid projectile player. Yes, you could make the argument for Seagull, but he's definitely not on a tier, sort of on the same tier as a lot of other good Genji players. And Dallas were also, I guess, with XQC being suspended, were missing a good Winston player. They're now bringing in a few other players to sort of help out on the issues that they were having in the previous stage, which should help them out. It's going to be a bit of an awkward fit, I think, especially because they've signed AKM. It's a bit confusing in terms of the fact that they've already got Taimu, so I don't really know where they're going with that one. But still, a lot of these teams, any additions are going to be helping them out realistically, because it gives them so many more options to work with, and especially if you start building towards 12-man rosters, you can start getting those internal scrims going, like London were doing. And this is a little bit of information. I'm not sure if I said it on the desk on the day, but for the playoffs for Stage 1, London actually couldn't find anyone to scrim, so they just scrimmed internally. Like, it's such a massive advantage having these 12-man rosters. Literally, it provides you much more flexibility compared to other teams, because any other team, if they were in London's position and they wanted to scrim just before the big match, they wouldn't have been able to. London did. They managed to prep on the maps that they weren't comfortable for, and it was a big reason why they actually managed to take the reverse sweep against New York Excelsior.
I think something that we maybe overestimated or underestimated, however you look at it, a little bit is some of the teams were kind of sleepers in Stage 1. Boston Uprising, I think, is probably the most obvious example of a team that people didn't really expect to do incredibly well. And then, boom, they're one match away from the Stage 1 playoffs. So in your opinion, do you have a sleeper to watch for Stage 2?
Personally, I'm going to be going with Gladiators, LA Gladiators, because I took one look at this roster in Stage 1 and I thought, well, the tanks are a bit of an unknown quantity in terms of working together, but I can see a ton of talent. Like, Big Goose didn't have a great performance in Stage 1. Again, I'd attribute that, to the fact that it wasn't a Lucio set meta game. Shaz had a reasonable performance. I believe he was above average in terms of Zenyatta statistics. So they've got a very solid support duo. The DPS players on Gladiators, as well as that, they all work well together. They've got some fantastic DPS players in terms of having Hydration, Surefour, Asher. Asher, when he's playing consistently, is on the level of some top tracers, in my opinion. However, that's his main issue, is consistency. And there was always the question mark here with their tanks, because their tank play has not been the greatest. But now they brought in Fissure. Now, Fissure is one of the best Winstons in the league, and it looks like we are most likely going to be going into either a tank-dominated meta or a dive-dominated meta. The addition of Fissure to this roster now is going to open things up massively, because now you've got a really solid main tank player to really just build this core around and build strategies around. So this should help them out a ton. So LA Gladiators, that's my personal sleeper team to watch. I'm definitely curious to see if they can capitalize on the sort of pieces they've got here now and sort of make it work, when they're putting it all together.
So, Bren, I've got to thank you for coming on the show. I have one more question. Well, not really a question. I want to give you just a platform to kind of give us any of your thoughts kind of from the team perspective going into Stage 2. And then I'll let you go back to hitting the slopes with the broadcast team. But yeah, just any other things you think that we should be discussing or thinking about from the team perspective as we go into Stage 2?
I am just looking forward to seeing if these Western teams can keep it up with the Korean teams. Now, there's a whole bunch of variables that come into play here in terms of why the Korean teams didn't perform as well as we assumed they would. For me personally, I feel like it comes down to a variety of factors. Firstly, being that these Korean players are away from home, so it's not as bad. Now, this is something I've been told by, I believe, Monty Doa, Alberto, Crumbs, that is, the people who have lived in Korea. I'm not sure who told me it, but it was somebody who had spent a lot of time around Korean teams. And they said to me, it's not as bad when Korean players are away from home when they're with an entire team of Korean players. They don't really feel the homesick effect as well. Especially being in LA, you've got Koreatown so close. It's not as bad. However, I feel like that still plays a part, is the fact that they have had to migrate to a completely different culture, a completely different area, completely different part of the world, which is never going to help. But also, the Mercy meta, as I already mentioned earlier, is one of the main reasons why we saw such close results between these teams. Because if you go back and watch the games, you'll notice a lot of these Western teams, they just prioritize building up Valkyrie. That's the only thing they'll do, and that'll be their win condition for these fights. Now, there are teams that are better than that. Valiant, Outlaws, they set up win conditions in terms of their actual positioning in team fights. So towards the later end of the stage 1, I mainly just took a look at map view for when the games were playing out, because you could really see the teams that had some sort of cohesive strategy being employed. That I rarely even watched the main game, maybe just the main feed, that is. I mainly only looked at map view, which is something we have access to on the analyst desk. And it was super interesting to see. So I feel like there are some Western teams, some mainly Western teams like Outlaws and Valiant, that are not going to be struggling as hard. However, the other teams I am a bit worried for, because we're coming into it now where if you are not sharpened up, if your cohesion, if your synergy as a team is not all there, you're going to really just get crushed by a lot of these Korean teams where they've had years and years and years of practice of focus fire and calling. Now, I'd love to be proven wrong in this aspect. However, I think it's going to be a hard one for them to overcome.
So first and foremost, thank you again to Bren. He took time out of his kind of 10-day break before he has to go back into all of that Overwatch spectating and analyzing, and it's a lot of work, so I can't thank him enough for coming on the show. Make sure to follow him on Twitter at BrenCaths, and of course, you can watch him analyzing the Overwatch League from the analyst desk throughout essentially the entire season. So again, huge thank you to that. That's it for the shows between Stage 1 and Stage 2. This was our Stage 2 primer series. Just as a friendly reminder, the games now start at 4 p.m. Pacific time, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, and then 1 p.m. Pacific time on Saturday. So that's going to be a change. That means I'm going to lose a lot more sleep, but it does mean it's going to be a change. On Wednesday, working on something special, so I can't tell you quite yet who our guest is going to be, but hoping it all comes together and it's a good one. So don't miss the next Overwatch League Daily on Wednesday. Of course, if you like this show, make sure to subscribe on YouTube, iTunes, your favorite podcast app of choice. Don't miss future episodes. You can also watch or listen to the show at winstonslab.com. By the way, if you are listening on iTunes, if you hop in and drop a little 5-star review, thanks a lot. Really appreciate it. No obligation, but it always helps when people are looking for their favorite Overwatch League shows, and tell them why. Also, you can find links to everything at overwatchleaguedaily.com. And of course, if you have a question or comment, email me, overwatchleaguedaily@gmail.com. I'll answer personally, and if it's good, we'll even talk about it on the show. Thanks again to Bren for joining me. I'll be back on Wednesday, the special guest for another episode of Overwatch League Daily.